Alright, RC Sproul on Ligonier's website today, July 1st, 2010, has another video in the predestination series, and so I wanted to share it with you as well. I know there's a possibility that some people are, they don't want to hear somebody else, blah blah blah, but believe me, RC Sproul can explain these things much better than I could, and so I just wanted to share them with you. His teaching has impacted my thinking, so I just challenge you, whether you believe his position or not, engage with what he says to understand better why you yourself believe the way you do. So let's continue on. RC Sproul, his broadcast today is called The Divine Choice.
This is RC Sproul with Renewing Your Mind. In every baseball game, there is a pause that takes place. We call it the 7th inning stretch, where people just take a moment off before the game resumes in full dynamics. And that's kind of the way it is in ministry.
As we shall see today, there's no third option, and the Apostle Paul makes it clear on what basis God predestines people. Just like today, Paul's answer was not without controversy. If you have your Bible with you, open it to Romans chapter 9 as we continue with our series on predestination. To find out more on what the basis of election is and what it isn't, here's Dr. Sproul with The Divine Choice.
We continue now with our study of the controversial doctrine of election or predestination. In our last session, we looked at Paul's golden chain in the 8th chapter of Romans, in which he talked about this sequence in which first there's foreknowledge, then predestination, then calling, then justification, then glorification, this order of salvation as we examined it. And I tried to point out some of the inherent difficulties found in that text with those who want to argue that all predestination involves is God's prior knowledge of what we will do when we meet the opportunity to hear the gospel and respond one way or the other. Because the basic issue in this debate is this: in the final analysis, what is the decisive factor upon which a person's salvation ultimately depends? Is it on the human decision, on the human response, which God knows in advance, or is it on God's sovereign election by which he brings people sovereignly to faith in Jesus Christ? That's what the debate is all about. I have a friend who teaches at Reformed Seminary, who for many, many years was the head of the theology department at Gordon Conwell Seminary, a man from Switzerland, the great French Baptist theologian Roger Nicole. And Dr. Nicole once made a comment to me. He said, "R.C., all people are born, they are by nature Pelagian," meaning by that they all believe by nature that man fundamentally is not enslaved by sin as a result of the fall of Adam and Eve, and still have the power within their own fallen natures, if they're fallen at all, to make this decisive movement by inclining themselves towards faith and making that decision for Christ. Almost all contemporary evangelism presupposes the moral ability of sinners to incline their own souls and their own hearts to a positive response to the gospel. And Nicole went on to say to me, and he said, regeneration or conversion does not automatically eliminate that kind of thinking from our minds. And when he said that to me, I was a little bit chagrined, because I had to say mea culpa. Because when I became a Christian, in my Christian experience, I assumed that I was the one who did it, You know, I knew that I couldn't be redeemed apart from the grace of God or from the work of Jesus Christ, but I assumed that the reason why I believed and my buddies persisted in unbelief was because I made the right decision and they made the wrong decision. And I'm not sure why, but I figured that the decisive thing was in me, not in the plan of God. And when I first read the New Testament and read all this business about election and predestination and the sovereignty of God and all of that, I was befuddled by that, and I didn't like the idea of divine election, you know, that God chooses certain people to be objects of his everlasting mercy and passes over others. It seems so grossly unfair to me and dehumanizing, and I asked all the questions that are asked, like what does this mean for free will, and what does this mean about the character of God? Is God arbitrary? Is he capricious? Is he whimsical in all of this? And fundamentally, is he fair? Those are the questions that I was raising, and we'll be addressing those questions, by the way, God willing, before this series is over. But if anybody fought this doctrine of election tooth and nail, it was I, for 5 years, and against some very formidable teachers. I had a professor in college who had his PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a master's in theology from a Reformed seminary, and he was teaching the Augustinian view of predestination to me for 4 years in college, and I resisted it all 4 years and graduated still believing the prescient view and not the Augustinian view. And then I went to seminary, and there I come face to face with the king of the Calvinists, John Gerstner, who's probably the most able defender of the Augustinian view alive in our century. And I had the temerity to resist Gerstner for quite some time, and then two things converged to wipe me out. One was being exposed to the work of Jonathan Edwards and his magnum opus, The Freedom of the Will, a very weighty volume on this question. And it was really while I was studying The Freedom of the Will that I changed my mind. But it was not just Edwards alone or Gerstner alone, it was both of them together forcing me to deal with the biblical text, and most importantly, Romans chapter 9. It was the 9th chapter of Romans, not the 8th chapter of Romans that we've already looked at, that I simply couldn't get past. And I finally reluctantly acquiesced to the doctrine, but not gladly. I said, okay, if this is what the Bible teaches, then all right, I'll swallow it, but I don't have to like it. But then, as I mentioned before, it wasn't long until I began to see the sweetness of the doctrine and began to delight in it. But there is a poetic justice here, because ever since that time, I've been teaching theology for 30 years and teaching this doctrine for 30 years, and have to run up against people every day in my life who are vociferously resisting what I'm teaching and giving me the same arguments I used to give these other men, and I said it serves me right. I've earned this dilemma to have to be in. But really what I'm trying to say to you is, if you're struggling with this, you'll get sympathy from me, because I struggled with this for an awfully long time.
Okay, we're going to stop there for the sake of time of this video, and we'll pick up with the next one.